On a calm suburban afternoon, Buddy, a vigilant German shepherd with a rust-colored coat and keen amber eyes, suddenly stood rigid, his ears pricked toward a manhole at the edge of the street. His deep, insistent barking shattered the peace, startling his owner, Emma. The neighborhood, which usually basked in quiet during this hour, felt different today. Buddy's bark wasn't his usual alert for a passing car or the neighborhood cat. It carried a sense of urgency, almost desperation. Emma, a woman in her early 40s with short crop hair and a warm, steady demeanor, stepped onto her front porch, her brow furrowed in confusion. She knew Buddy well. His instincts were always sharp, and she had learned to trust them. His behavior today, however, was unlike anything she had seen before. As she approached, her voice soft in an attempt to soothe him, Buddy remained unyielding, barking relentlessly at the manhole as if it demanded his full attention. "Buddy, what is it?" Emma asked, reaching out to gently pat his head. Buddy's ears didn't so much as twitch. His focus was locked, his body trembling with tension, his nose twitching toward the rusted metal cover of the manhole. A low growl began to rise from deep within his chest, and Emma's concern grew. The manhole itself looked ordinary, its metallic grid pattern slightly worn from years of exposure to the elements. Yet, the way Buddy fixated on it made Emma uneasy. What could possibly be underneath? Her mind raced with mundane explanations. Perhaps a small animal had gotten trapped below, or there was a peculiar smell only Buddy could detect. Still, his intensity hinted at something more serious. As Emma crouched beside Buddy, trying to catch a glimpse of what he might be sensing, the commotion began attracting the attention of the neighbors. One by one, doors opened, and people trickled out of their homes, curious and a little wary. Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly woman who had lived next door to Emma for as long as she could remember, hobbled over with her cane, her face etched with concern. "Is everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Caldwell called out, her voice slightly shaky. She eyed Buddy warily, unused to seeing the usually calm dog in such a state. Emma shook her head, still crouched beside her dog. "I don't know. He's never acted like this before." Her voice was tinged with unease, and she couldn't shake the knot forming in her stomach. Buddy continued to bark, each sharp sound echoing down the quiet street. A few more neighbors gathered, exchanging puzzled glances and whispering among themselves. Dogs had instincts that often surpassed human understanding, and the longer Buddy kept up his frantic behavior, the more the crowd grew concerned. "Maybe you should call someone," suggested Mr. Daniels from across the street, his voice gruff but laced with genuine concern. "Dogs don't act up like this for no reason." At first, the suggestion seemed unnecessary, but then again, Buddy was no ordinary pet. He had been with Emma long enough for her to know that his instincts were never wrong. If he sensed something was off, there was likely more to the situation than met the eye. Finally, after a long moment of hesitation, Emma nodded. I think you're right," she agreed, pulling her phone from her pocket. The small crowd watched as she dialed, and within minutes, the familiar sight of a police cruiser rolled down the street. Two officers stepped out, both of them looking slightly amused by the scene before them. Officer Rodriguez, a young man with sharp features and a casual demeanor, raised an eyebrow at the growing group of neighbors surrounding a dog and a manhole. His partner, Officer Davis, an older and more serious man, followed closely behind, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Is there a problem here?" Rodriguez asked with a smirk, his eyes flicking toward Buddy, who had not relented in his barking. Emma stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees. "I'm not sure," she began, her voice steady despite the oddity of the situation. "Buddy here, he's been fixated on this manhole for the past half hour. He won't leave it alone, and he's usually not like this. I thought it might be worth having someone check it out." Rodriguez exchanged a glance with his partner, his smile fading as he crouched down near the manhole. Buddy growled low, his fur standing on end, as if warning the officer not to get too close. The officer paused, then frowned. "There's a weird smell," Rodriguez muttered, sniffing the air cautiously. "Can you smell that?" Officer Davis stepped closer, his expression hardening as he too caught the faint, acrid scent seeping from the edges of the manhole cover. "Yeah, I smell it," he confirmed, his voice gruff. He looked at Emma, then at the crowd of concerned neighbors. "We should open it up." The tension in the air thickened as the officers moved to retrieve the necessary tools from their car. Emma felt her heart pounding harder now, her hands instinctively tightening on Buddy's leash. What could be down there? She glanced around at her neighbors, many of them now silent, watching the officers with a mixture of curiosity and dread. When the officers returned and prepared to lift the manhole cover, the crowd edged closer, and Buddy's barking grew more frenzied. Whatever was beneath, it was becoming clearer that it wasn't just some small animal. The strange smell that now filled the air hinted at something far more ominous. As the officers began to pry open the manhole, Buddy lunged forward, his barks turning into growls so deep and threatening that it sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Whatever was hidden below had him on edge like never before. Emma held her breath as the cover finally creaked open, revealing the darkness beneath. Officer Rodriguez took out his flashlight, shining it down into the manhole. His expression twisted slightly as the beam cut through the blackness. "There's something down there," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in closer, and the crowd behind him grew deathly silent. "What is it?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. Rodriguez shook his head, his face pale. "I'm not sure, but it doesn't look good," he replied, his voice grim. And with that, the uneasy silence of the suburban afternoon was shattered, leaving everyone to wonder just what they had uncovered. Buddy's sharp instincts weren't something Emma ever took lightly. As the tension in the air grew thicker, she found herself reflecting on the story behind her loyal companion. Buddy hadn't always been a regular household pet. Emma had adopted him from a rescue shelter 2 years ago, but his past was far from ordinary. He had once been part of a specialized search and rescue team. Emma still remembered the day she met him at the shelter, his sharp eyes, alert posture, and the way the staff spoke of him with such respect. He was no stranger to danger, and it was clear he had seen more than most dogs ever would. Emma had fallen in love with Buddy's gentle yet vigilant nature, and over time, they had formed a bond that went beyond the typical human-animal connection. His training as a rescue dog remained deeply ingrained, making him acutely aware of danger, something that had saved Emma before during a hiking trip. She had slipped on a rocky trail, and it was Buddy who had found the path back to safety. His unerring sense of direction and calmness under pressure had been remarkable then. Now, as she stood beside him, watching the police work, Emma felt a familiar pang of worry. Buddy wasn't just alert, he was terrified. The police officers, too, seemed more uneasy now as they continued their cautious inspection of the manhole. Officer Davis, the more seasoned of the two, radioed for backup, while Officer Rodriguez, younger and still trying to maintain his composure, kept his flashlight aimed down into the dark tunnel below. Buddy's growls rumbled like distant thunder, growing louder and more frantic with every passing minute. Emma tightened her grip on his leash, her palms slick with nervous sweat. She could feel Buddy's muscles tensing beneath her fingers, his body vibrating with a kind of intensity she had never felt from him before. "Emma, maybe you should step back," Rodriguez suggested, glancing over his shoulder at her. His expression was more serious now, the earlier hint of amusement completely gone. "We don't know what's down there." Emma hesitated, torn between wanting to obey and feeling the overwhelming need to stay close. Every instinct told her to trust the police, but Buddy was her anchor in this moment. "I'll stay close," she replied, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Buddy. Just as the officers began to discuss their next steps, Rodriguez spoke quietly, catching Emma's attention. "You know, there have been a few reports lately," he muttered, looking toward Davis. "Strange noises in the neighborhood. People said they heard things at night, but no one took it seriously." Emma's pulse quickened. "What kind of noises?" she asked, her voice thin with worry. Several neighbors leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Even those who had stood back, hesitant to get involved, now seemed drawn to the conversation. Rodriguez shrugged, still peering into the manhole. Mostly sounds of scratching, some banging. People figured it was just raccoons or something. But now, with this smell, I don't know. That doesn't sound like raccoons, Mrs. Caldwell interjected, her voice shaky. She clutched her cane tightly, her knuckles turning white. I've lived here for 30 years. I've never heard anything like that. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the rising tension. The mention of strange noises unsettled everyone. People exchanged uneasy glances, whispering in hushed tones. Something about the situation, combined with Buddy's unrelenting behavior, made it clear this wasn't going to end with a simple explanation. Buddy, however, seemed to know better. His growls deepened, his fur bristling along his back as he tugged against the leash. It was as if he was urging Emma to follow him into the darkness below, to discover what only he could sense. Dogs can pick up on things we can't, Emma murmured to herself, remembering something she had once read about working breeds like Buddy. German Shepherds, especially those trained for search and rescue, were known for their heightened senses. They could detect smells buried deep underground, hear sounds far beyond human hearing, and even sense shifts in body language that hinted at fear or unease. Rodriguez straightened up, his earlier confidence eroding. "We're going to have to go down there," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had before. Something's definitely off. Emma watched them prepare to descend, her stomach churning. Every part of her wanted to call them back, to grab Buddy and run. But she couldn't. Something was pulling her to stay. Perhaps the same instinct that drove Buddy to continue his relentless watch. The foul smell, now heavier in the air, and the agitated state of her dog made it impossible to turn away. Whatever was down there needed to be found. Davis looked at Emma one more time, his expression softening. "Ma'am, it's probably best if you and the dog stay back. This could get dangerous." Emma nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to move far. She held Buddy close by her side, his leash wrapped tightly in her trembling hand. The neighbors, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped back as well, forming a tense semicircle around the scene. Rodriguez and Davis exchanged a grim look, then began their descent into the manhole. As the officers lowered themselves into the tunnel, Buddy's barking reached a fevered pitch. Emma crouched beside him, whispering soft reassurances, though her own fear was growing. Buddy's wide, frantic eyes were locked on the darkness below. His entire body was rigid, his ears pinned back, a clear sign of his distress. The sound of Rodriguez's voice echoed up from the manhole, startling everyone. "There's something down here, clothes, and it looks like someone's been living here." Emma's heart dropped into her stomach. She exchanged horrified glances with her neighbors, their faces pale in the fading daylight. The tunnel wasn't just a forgotten piece of old infrastructure. Someone had been using it, hiding beneath their quiet, suburban neighborhood. Buddy let out a low, guttural growl, his teeth bared. The sight of his usually calm demeanor, so completely transformed, sent a cold shiver down Emma's spine. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just an ordinary discovery. Buddy, with his sharp instincts, knew it too. Rodriguez's voice crackled over his radio, more urgent now. "We need backup, now." The weight of the situation pressed down on Emma's chest. The strange noises, the foul smell, the hidden tunnel, it was all connected. As the officers ventured deeper, Buddy's agitation grew stronger, and Emma could only hold on to his leash, praying they weren't about to uncover something far worse than they had imagined. As the air grew heavier with the smell rising from the manhole, it seemed like an invisible force was pressing down on everyone. Emma, standing frozen next to Buddy, felt the tension radiating from him like a coiled spring ready to snap. His fur bristled, his muscles tight, and his growls low and steady. Even though Officer Rodriguez had suggested she step back, Emma couldn't tear herself away. Something terrible was lurking down there, and Buddy knew it better than anyone. Below, Rodriguez's flashlight cut through the darkness of the tunnel, revealing damp, crumbling walls and scattered debris. His face tightened as he knelt down, inspecting what lay before him. "It's not just clothes," he said into his radio, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's more down here. Someone's been living here recently." Davis, who had followed Rodriguez, turned his flashlight toward a narrow passage that extended deeper underground. "This isn't just some abandoned spot. These things are recent," he muttered, his hand hovering over his gun, tension mounting in his voice. Above ground, Emma strained to hear the officer's words, though the pounding of her own heartbeat was nearly drowning them out. Buddy's growling grew louder, more frantic, his body trembling with energy. The small crowd of neighbors that had gathered stood silent now, fear spreading across their faces. Everyone sensed it. Something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio again, but this time with more urgency. "You're going to want to see this," he called out. "There's a passage down here, and it's got belongings. I think someone's been living here." And his voice faltered for a moment before returning, more serious than before. "There are chains, shackles." A chill ran through Emma's body. Shackles. The word hit her like a physical blow, and she had to steady herself, the implications racing through her mind. Nearby, Mrs. Caldwell gasped, her knuckles white as she gripped her cane. Whispers spread among the neighbors, but no one could tear their eyes away from the manhole. Buddy, now baring his teeth, let out a deep, threatening growl, unlike anything Emma had heard from him before. He strained at his leash, pulling toward the tunnel as if he knew exactly what kind of danger lay below. Emma's hand tightened on the leash, her heart racing. Shackles. Davis's voice came through the radio, echoing the shock everyone felt. His flashlight moved quickly, scanning the area. "What kind of place is this?" Rodriguez's response was grim. "Looks like a makeshift prison. We need backup." Now, as the gravity of the situation sank in, the uneasy atmosphere around the manhole intensified. People shifted nervously, exchanging horrified glances. The image of someone being held captive in that dark, hidden tunnel beneath their peaceful neighborhood was almost too much to comprehend. But Buddy's reaction said it all. This wasn't just a forgotten space. Something truly sinister had been happening below their feet. Emma's breath quickened, her mind racing. What kind of person would chain someone up down there? How long had they been trapped? The thought was suffocating. Buddy tugged harder on his leash, his entire body pulling toward the entrance of the tunnel. His instincts, honed by years of training as a rescue dog, were on full alert. He wasn't just sensing something. He knew there was danger, possibly a life at stake. She remembered reading about how rescue dogs like Buddy were trained not just to find missing people, but to detect danger, signs of fear, violence, or distress that humans could overlook. Buddy wasn't just reacting to the smell or the strange situation. He was responding to something deeper, something more primal. He had likely been in situations like this before during his rescue days, and it was clear that every fiber of his being was telling him that there was a life on the line. Officer Rodriguez's head popped up from the manhole as he climbed back to the surface, his face pale and grim. "We need to clear the area," he said, addressing the group of neighbors. "There's evidence of a crime down there, a serious one. We're going to need more units to secure this place." The small crowd began to disperse, murmuring anxiously, their faces etched with shock. Mrs. Caldwell turned away, muttering under her breath, while others hurried back to their homes, locking doors behind them. The peaceful neighborhood was now anything but. Fear had taken root. Despite the growing distance of the crowd, Emma remained where she was, her hands still clutching Buddy's leash, as if it were the only thing grounding her to the moment. Her mind was spinning, trying to process what they had just discovered. Shackles. A prison. Someone had been down there, trapped in the dark, beneath the very street she walked on every day. Backup arrived swiftly, more officers, a few detectives, and even an ambulance, though they weren't sure yet if anyone would need it. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and the police moved efficiently, though the weight of the discovery was clear on every one of their faces. Emma felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Officer Rodriguez, his eyes softening for a moment as he looked at her and Buddy. "It's probably best if you take Buddy home now," he said gently. "We'll handle it from here." Emma nodded slowly, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. She glanced down at Buddy, who was still fixated on the manhole, his body vibrating with pent-up energy. He wasn't ready to leave, and neither was she. Something about this whole ordeal didn't sit right with her. The officers were trained to handle situations like this, but Buddy's instincts had proven right from the start. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had uncovered was only the beginning. As the night settled in and darkness fell over the once peaceful neighborhood, the atmosphere remained heavy with tension from what had been uncovered. The flashing lights of the police cruisers and the yellow tape surrounding the manhole added to the growing sense of dread. Emma stood on her front porch, watching as more officers and detectives arrived to investigate the hidden tunnel beneath their feet. Buddy sat at her side, his alert gaze never straying far from the scene, his ears twitching at every sound. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly wrong. Buddy, usually able to relax once a situation was resolved, remained tense, his body coiled like a spring. His instincts had been right from the start, and Emma trusted him completely. If Buddy still believed there was danger, she couldn't let herself relax either. Down in the tunnel, the officers had uncovered more disturbing evidence. Davis and Rodriguez, along with two detectives who had arrived as backup, slowly made their way through the narrow underground passage. The foul odor grew stronger the deeper they went, and their flashlights revealed remnants of what appeared to be a makeshift living space. Old blankets, empty food containers, and discarded clothing. "What kind of person lives down here?" Rodriguez muttered, his voice tinged with disgust. His flashlight swept across the ground, revealing more chains and the sickening sight of a stained mattress shoved against one wall. Davis's face tightened. Whoever it is, they didn't want to be found, or they were keeping someone down here against their will. Rodriguez turned to the detective, his expression grim. "Do you think we'll find them?" The detective didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the tunnel. "We'll see," he finally said, his voice low. "But something tells me they're still here. Somewhere, back on the surface." Emma's nerves were stretched thin as she watched the police activity. She kept glancing down at Buddy, who hadn't relaxed for a moment. His keen eyes darted back and forth, watching the officers, his ears flicking at the faintest noise coming from the manhole. Emma knelt beside him, resting a hand on his back. "What is it, boy?" "What'd he sense?" Buddy stood up suddenly, his body rigid. His nose twitched, and his ears were perked forward as if he had picked up on something the humans had missed. Emma followed his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. A low growl escaped from Buddy's throat, and he took a step toward the police barricade. Emma's pulse quickened. "What is it, Buddy?" At that moment, one of the officers below radioed back to the surface. His voice was tense. "We found something, someone." The words sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Buddy tugged hard on the leash, his growl deepening. Without thinking, Emma rose to her feet and followed his lead toward the manhole. The officers tried to stop her, but Buddy's insistence was undeniable. One of the detectives nodded reluctantly, allowing her to come closer. The officers had discovered a hidden compartment in the tunnel, tucked away behind a false wall. Inside, they found a figure, a person, alive, but barely conscious. The man was shackled to the wall, his clothes filthy and torn, his skin pale and gaunt from what appeared to be weeks, if not months, of captivity. The air in the tunnel had grown cold, damp, and oppressive, and the sight before them was horrifying. Rodriguez and Davis quickly called for medical assistance as they rushed to free the captive. His eyes fluttered open as the officers gently loosened the restraints, but he was too weak to speak. His breathing was shallow, his body limp. One of the paramedics, who had descended into the tunnel, muttered, "He's severely dehydrated, malnourished. We've got to get him out of here quickly." Buddy barked sharply from above, his tail wagging slightly now, as if sensing that his job wasn't quite done, but that they were on the right track. Emma's heart swelled with pride and relief. Buddy's instincts had led them to the truth. If it weren't for him, the man might never have been found. The paramedics worked swiftly, securing the man on a stretcher before carefully lifting him to the surface. As the stretcher was raised, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The man's eyes opened briefly, locking with hers for a fleeting moment before they closed again. His face was drawn and hollow, but that brief connection told Emma everything. He had been saved in the nick of time. Emma knelt down beside Buddy, who sat back on his haunches, watching the scene unfold. She stroked his head softly. "You did it, boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved him." The officers and detectives exchanged grim looks, the reality of the situation settling in. This wasn't just a hidden tunnel or an abandoned space. It was a prison. Whoever had been keeping this man down there had gone to great lengths to conceal their crime, and it was clear now that they had been living in plain sight, right under the noses of the community. As the paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance, Rodriguez approached Emma. "You and your dog. You saved his life," he said, his tone sincere. "If Buddy hadn't alerted us, I don't know if we would have found him in time." Emma glanced down at Buddy, who was finally starting to relax, his body no longer tense. "He's special," she replied, her voice filled with admiration. "He's always known when something's wrong." Rodriguez nodded. "We'll be launching a full investigation, but for now, you should be proud of him." "We all are." Emma watched as the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the night. The police remained on the scene, continuing their investigation, but Emma felt a sense of closure settling over her. Buddy had done what he was trained to do, what he was born to do. His past as a rescue dog had never left him, and tonight, it had saved a life. As she turned to walk back to her house, Buddy trotted beside her, his tail wagging gently. The tension that had gripped him all afternoon had finally eased. Emma glanced down at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. In that moment, she remembered other times when Buddy had been there for her, from the hiking trip where he had found the way back when she was lost, to countless smaller moments where his instincts had guided them through uncertain times. Tonight, he had proven once again how extraordinary he truly was. "What would I do without you?" she whispered. Buddy looked up at her, his eyes bright, and for the first time that day, he seemed completely at ease. Whatever had been lurking beneath the surface was no longer a threat, thanks to him. Emma couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if Buddy hadn't been there, his instincts leading them to uncover the terrible secret hidden below their quiet neighborhood. As they stepped onto the porch, Emma paused, taking one last look at the manhole in the distance. The mystery had been revealed, but the questions still lingered. Who had done this? And would they ever be caught? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside for now. Tonight, Buddy had done what no one else could have done, and that was enough. She knelt down beside him, pressing her forehead gently against his. "You're extraordinary, Buddy." And as they finally walked inside, Emma couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief. Whatever had been hidden beneath the surface was gone, and Buddy, her faithful companion, had once again proven himself to be her protector, her hero.